If you're viewing this live stream webinar already, I invite you to type in the chat your name, and we could start the conversation going. Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this do-it-yourself Seder class. This is going to be 60 minutes covering the basics of leading a Seder. For many of us, this will be the first time leading a Seder. And for those of us that have led Seders in the past, maybe you'd like a refresher. So we're going to cover the basics tonight. Passover is but this year we're doing it in a unique way where everyone's doing it by themselves at home. and so it takes on unique characteristics. So we're going to cover the basics of leading a Seder. Now, I advise in the description of this video, in the bottom of the video, even below the chat, there's 3 links that we shared, and they're each 3 PDF documents. One is a Seder checklist, which is just handy to have of different items you'll need to lead a Seder. And then the second 2 is related to especially a special request that was made about making a Seder. Some of our fondest memories are from Seders growing up, but we may remember the Seders being very, very long. And for some of us, we're not ready to do a long Seder. We just want to know what are the fundamentals. So in this class, we'll be covering the fundamentals. And in the document in the description shared, Seder step by step, it walks you through the fundamentals. They could do a whole Seder in 30 minutes. Now, ideally, we should do the whole Seder as instructed in the Haggadah, but in the Seder step by step, it is guiding you through the most fundamentals to make a basic and yet meaningful Seder. And the other document in the description, Haggadah Selections, that is a abridged Haggadah that takes you through all the main requirements to do the Seder, this 30-minute Seder. Ideally, we should do the whole Seder, but for those of us that more than 30 minutes is not, there are a few key ingredients that are important, and those are things we should make an emphasis to do, and that's what we're going to be presenting here. We're going to be presenting here the fundamentals and the basics, adding some meaning and insight. So I invite you to open up those links in the description, Seder step by step, and the Haggadah selections in 2 windows. If you only have an option of opening one, so do the Seder step by step and follow along. It also has a diagram on the top of the page that will help you understand the flow of the Seder plate as well. So let us begin. Seder, do it yourself, DIY, and I'm open to any questions that you may have. No question is insignificant, and in fact, the Seder night is a night full of questions. So when we think of getting together, for Passover, there's a famous joke of the man from Phoenix. That elderly man, he calls up his son in New York. He says, I have to tell you something, Josh. I don't want to ruin your day, but me and mom in the past few days have really gotten into bitter fight, and I'm divorcing your mom. And Josh says, divorcing mom after 45 years of marriage? How can you do that? That's such a drastic step. He says, no, son, I'm sick and tired. I can no longer talk to your mom. I'm so fed up and angry. I can't even pass on the message to your sister. If you don't mind passing on the message to her. So and he hangs up. So Josh quickly calls up his sister in Chicago and says, did you hear the news? Dad is planning on divorcing mom. And this is crazy. They had 45 years of a beautiful marriage and they're going to throw it away. So Rachel calls up Dad and says, Dad, don't you do anything drastic. Me and Josh are flying right over. And don't you do anything till we get there. The dad hangs up, turns to his wife and says, perfect. Josh and Rachel are coming for Passover and they're paying their own airfare. So it's always been the dream of parents to celebrate the Seder surrounded by family and friends. And it's something that I have looked forward to all my life, doing community Seders, doing Seder amongst a larger company that reflects unity. But there's something unique and significant this year about celebrating at home. So we're going to go through the basics. Now, we're starting with the Seder. There's the requirement of getting rid of chametz. We shouldn't have any leavened bread in our house on Pesach, and that includes cereal and pasta and other things like that. And that's why I highly recommend that everyone take the step while watching this video or afterwards to go online to our website, jewishtob.org, and sell their chametz. It is so important and so easy. But that's not what this lesson is about. So we will focus on this lesson, which is about conducting the Seder. Now, I want to share you, because many of us might have the feeling that so many things are canceled. Let's cancel the Seder too. So I just want to share a little selection that I've uh, came across. This is a description by a resident of the Vihingen concentration camp. His name was Meisha Pearl. He was one of the residents, so to speak, of this camp, of this concentration camp, and it was year 1943. And he describes one year a Pesach there. He says, the people in the camp, and I'm reading verbatim, the people in the camp were already used to their miserable situation. They saw death before their eyes, but they asked, where could we get flour? How could we bake matzah? Shortly before Passover, one of the SS men in the camp entered my workshop where I painted signs. He asked me to take my to make dummy targets for target practice. Just then, an idea flashed through my mind. I claimed that I would need flour, lots of flour, to paste the pictures of soldiers on the targets. He asked me how much flour. I said I would need 5 kilograms. He liked my suggestion and immediately gave me an appropriate referral. The Jews of the concentration went to work baking the matzah in secret, even though they knew that they would die if they were caught. They baked the matzah in the oven in Pearl's workroom, keeping the door and windows sealed. When the night of the Seder came, 20 Jews managed to pull off a Seder, where aside from the matzah they ate potatoes and drank homemade wine, which consisted of water and sugar. They even managed to read the Haggadah. While the Nazis succeeded in destroying so many Jewish lives, they failed to destroy the Jewish life from these Jews on that Passover. So that is a description. And it reminds us to put things in perspective, that even though we're going through a very difficult time, to remember this precious gift that we have, the Seder night, and to put it to use. Now, one of the things to recognize is that in a way, this year we're celebrating the Seder more like our ancestors in Egypt celebrated the Seder, because when we read the story of the night, the first Seder that the Jews experienced while they were still in Egypt. God said, put the blood on your doorpost, sit at home, don't go out of your home the entire night. Each family should be their own, making their own Seder, while the rest of Egypt was going through the plague of the death of the firstborn. So Jews, as much as a sense of community, on that first Passover, they did it in quarantine. Each family had to stay in their home doing it by themselves. And that's something very fundamental to think about. When this Jewish nation had just started, the first thing they had to remember is not to lose themselves in the nation. Many people, when joining something bigger than themselves, they lose their own personal identity. And God wanted to remind us, at the start of the Jewish nation, you have to remember not to lose the individuality, the personal family space. So that's how we started the birth of our nation, each family on their own, in their own home. And that's how we will be doing it this year as well. And so that's something to reflect on during this year's Seder, that will make it more meaningful to explore our individuality. What are we when we strip off our national identity? Who we are and what we have to make. Okay, so now I've got the question about, what about doing a Zoom Seder? I think the idea of gathering the family over Zoom is a great idea, just not on Seder night. You could do it before the night begins. Do it the Seder night, begin the candlelight Seder meetup and sing songs, the classic songs that the family knows, and every family has their own unique traditions. But once candlelighting time comes, it's time to do the Seders for ourselves in our own homes. Now, beyond the tradition of making a Seder, there's something strange about sitting around and making a meal commemorating an event that happened thousands of years ago. And for some of us, we may think it's a bit strange that what are the symptoms? Who has the symptoms? How long do you have to stay quarantined after you receive the symptoms? But we can't get lost on the symptoms. We have to remember that the symptoms are reflective of a core something at its core, which in the COVID-19 situation is the virus. And the same thing is in our Seder, that we do all these rituals in a Seder, but the rituals of the Seder reflect a higher energy that's present on this night. Jewish teaching teaches us that the reason that the Passover Exodus happened 3,000 years ago on that night wasn't just it was a random night, but actually that night had specific energies that and powers present in the world that made it conducive for the Jews to go free that night. And so the Jewish calendar is built as a spiral, it's cyclical in a sense, a spiral cyclical where each year we could tap into those energies, but on a deeper level. So on the one hand, we're experiencing the same energies that was present on the night of the first Exodus. At the same time, we're experiencing those energies on a deeper level. So it is really, the Seder is not a reliving of the first Seder, a remembrance of the first Seder, but it's actually a brand new experience that we are trying to bring about in our own life, our own personal exodus throughout the Seder. So we can't get caught up in the symptoms of the Seder. We have to remember the main goal of the Seder, which is tapping into the spiritual energies to actually become free in our own lives. Okay, so as we know, when we're sending an email, if you miss the dot, the period, the comma, the period in the email address, but if someone were to ask you how much cake to eat, what's the required amount of cake we must eat, how long does the happy birthday song have to last? So you'd say, you're a little OCD about this, just enjoy the cake and the birthday party. But when it comes to the Seder, since we're tapping into these special energies, we have to make sure we get the right frame in mind. So it's really important to get the details more or less right. And so when we think of the name of the Seder is Seder Pesach, the Passover Seder. And Seder in Hebrew means order. That means we have two goals at the same time. Two oppose. It's like a paradox. Seder means order. Passover means leaping, skipping, passing over, not orderly. And so we're actually the program that we're doing on Seder night is very orderly, but the goal is to make a giant leap. So we use it's almost like connecting to a Zoom conference. You're sitting in New York and you're connecting to someone across the world. That's a leap. But the address that you have to put in, the Zoom meeting ID, has to be perfect, or else you'll end up in the wrong place. So that's the goal of the Seder. It's a step-by-step guide to experiencing a personal freedom. And so we have to get all the details right. When you're across the line, your car's parked across the white line a few inches, you could get a parking ticket. Things have a certain precision to it, but it helps us make these grand leaps. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to write the questions in the live chat. And I encourage you to please follow along this lesson with opening the link in the description, Seder step by step. Okay. Now, here's a famous thought experiment, a Hasidic thought experiment that I want you to consider. So imagine you have, on one side, you have a Jew who lives in Soviet Russia in the 1950s. He's banished to the distant Gulag for the crime of supporting Jewish observance. Passover nears. He's awaiting a package of matzah from his home, but it is intercepted by the authorities and confiscated. On Passover Eve, after hours of strenuous labor, he sits in the barracks, meditates on the meaning of matzah, tearfully yearning to fulfill the mitzvah. Let's put this character aside. Let's bring in person B. He lives in Manhattan in 2020. He leads a busy life. He has not attended a Seder in years. And one day, a coworker hands him a box of matzah and says, "Here, this is handmade shmor matzah for Passover, a gift, a pre-Passover gift." He brings it home. He puts it on his coffee table, forgets about it. Then the night, Seder night, he remembers the box. He's a little bored. He's a little hungry. He's in isolation. He pulls out the box. He eats some matzah with his dinner, and he robotically eats the matzah and goes to sleep for the night. So this thought experiment is, which person did the mitzvah of eating matzah? Is it person A or person B? The answer is B. The person who who ate the matzah did the mitzvah. The person who really desired to do the mitzvah and was trying to make it a sincere intent, at the end of the day, he didn't get the job done. So there's something here that teaches us about the importance of practically fulfilling all the mitzvahs. And at the same time, we know that God desires what's in our heart. God wants a relationship with us. He wants our full being. And of course, we have to be there and reciprocate. So there's these two elements of getting the facts right, the details right, eating the matzah, eating the mar, drinking the wine, and yet giving our whole heart as well. But the most important is actually doing the mitzvah itself. So we're going to focus the key ingredients that make the Seder. So that was like a long introduction. Now we're going to run through the Seder. The key items for the Seder, and I encourage you again to follow along in the step-by-step handout in the link in the description of this video. The key items of the Seder, 3 things. Number 1 is the matzah. Number 2 is the wine. And number 3 is the items on the Seder plate. So we'll first go through the basics of the matzah. The Torah tells us that on the night of Passover, we should eat matzah. The Jewish people prepared dough on the night of the Exodus, but rushing to leave, they didn't have time to wait for the dough to rise. When they reached their first stop outside of Egypt, they quickly baked this unleavened dough into matzah. So at its core, matzah is exclusively flour and water. It's just 2 ingredients. It's prepared and baked at great speed and high temperatures to prevent the dough from rising, leavening, or fermenting. We need it. So on our Seder plate, on our Seder table, we want to put 3 of these matzahs. At a minimum, we don't have to eat all 3, but it's there as it has great symbolism to it, and ideally we should have all 3. If there are more people at the table, so you might need more than 3 matzahs, but every stores, they have all these sales, buy this amount of food and you get a free box of matzah. But those are machine matzahs. They cost a few dollars a box. But then you have handmade shmur matzah, and I really wish I had a box here with me to show you, but unfortunately I do not. But it is really important and ideal to use the handmade matzah. It is much more similar to the matzah that our ancestors had when they left Egypt. It is round, like the matzahs the Jews made out of Egypt. It is handmade, and extreme precautions are taken to make sure that no water has touched the wheat or flour from the time of harvesting, to make sure that the time between when the water and flour come into contact is so minimal and quick that it's really kosher matzah. So that's the best matzah to use for the sin. So that's important for the matzah. Now, this has been a big push of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Someone once called him. He said, "I want to do something big, Rebbe. I want to give you I'll give you a blank check to do a big project." So the Rebbe said, "I want you to make sure to cover the check, to cover matzah, the shmur matzah, this handmade matzah, to distribute to all Jews around the world that may not be buying them or have them or could afford them." And he said, "Rebbe, I want to do something with a big impact. Matzah doesn't have a big impact. You eat it and then it's gone." The Rebbe said, "You want to do something with a big impact? This is a big impact. Because the Zohar says that this matzah, that handmade shmur matzah, if you eat it on the night of the Seder, it feeds a Jew faith and healing." And there are many stories of the Rebbe telling people who are going through illnesses or sicknesses to eat this matzah on the night of Passover, and they have become better. So especially this year, it is so important to eat shemura matzah. Okay, so that's the first element. The second element is the 4 cups. Every holiday and Shabbat, the Torah tells us that we have to make all Kiddush. And so Seder night, we have the same thing as well. And the sages said, whenever we make these declarations, we should do it over a cup of wine. So this is the special mitzvah of drinking the 4 cups of wine. We'll do it 4 times tonight. Now, if you're doing this abridged Seder, you'll be drinking 4 cups of wine pretty quickly over the duration of a half hour. So that's why it might be worthwhile to do a longer Seder. But the preferable way to do this mitzvah is drinking wine and red wine. But if you cannot do red wine, you can't tolerate, or the doctor says you should not be drinking any alcohol, or you have there's other reasons that you can't be drinking alcohol. Those are valid reasons, and so then you can stick to grape juice. Now, for those that like gematria is Jewish numerology, so we have an interesting numerology. The Seder is a night to experience freedom, which in Hebrew is the word cherut. Cherut means freedom. And if you do the numerology, and we're not going to spend too much time on this now, maybe I'll post it in the chat actually. Let's see if I could get this. Let me type this up. Okay, there we have the word kos yayin, a cup of wine. If you take every Hebrew letter is equal to a number. If you do the math, it equals 146. And if you do that times 4, because we drink 4 cups of wine, so then you have 624, which corresponds to the word cherut, cherut meaning freedom. So I'm going to type that in as well. Freedom 624. That's an interesting thing. But these 4 cups correspond to 4 stages of redemption. Every exodus, even a personal exodus, goes through leaving our it's like almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that as you go through an exodus, you have to go through 4 stages, but now's not the time to delve deeper into that. And so these first 2 ingredients, the matzah and the wine, actually are important primary themes that we have to think about. Matzah is very simple tasting. It's just flour and water. Wine is a very rich and enjoyable ingredient. And when we're trying to connect to Hashem, so on the one hand, we have to bring richness and enjoyment to our Judaism and to our religious experience. On the other hand, we can't only serve God with things that we like and what's convenient, and things that God wants from us but are not too convenient for us or we don't enjoy doing. Those we skip. That's not a real relationship. In a marriage, if you only do the things that you enjoy doing but not what's needed, so then what kind of relationship is that? So in the Seder, we're actually trying to balance both. On the one hand, be like matzah, be very humble and sincere and do what needs to be done, even if we can't relate to it or appreciate the significance. On the other hand, we drink the wine to symbolize the great joy and delight and try to find an area of connection and resonance with what we're doing on the Seder night. So we do things at the Seder that we don't understand, but many of us also have parts of the Seder that we find deeply meaningful. And both of those elements are extremely important. So now let's go on to the basics of the Seder plate. This is item number 3. Again, it's in the handout chart and the description, Seder step by step, but I'm showing a picture here for everyone to see. This is the items on the Seder plate, and I understand possibly that it's in reverse in the camera, so my forgiveness. We have 6 items on the Seder plate, and they each have symbolisms. Some of these items are universal. That means no matter where you are in the world, wherever you go to a Jewish Seder plate, you will see that item on the Seder plate. Other items are different families have different traditions, and even the arranged plate. So So here's an example of something that's universal. Actually, we'll start, before we get to that, we'll start with the Zerah. The first two items on the Seder plate are symbolic items. They're items that are not really meant for doing a mitzvah at the Seder. They're there to serve as a reminder of the Seder, the way it was done in temple times. When the Jews were living in the Holy Land with the Holy Temple, all males used to travel to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage for 3 times a year, and every time they would visit the temple, they would bring a special sacrifice. That was called the Karban Chagiga, the festival offering. And on Passover, they brought the extra one, which was the Paschal lamb, which was an offering and also eaten together with the family in Jerusalem. So these first two items on the Seder plate on the top are cooked dishes that we put on the Seder plate to remind us of those two special offerings that the Jewish people offered in the Holy Temple that brought them close to God. And so they don't have this one is called Zeraya, which means an outstretched arm. It is done with a shank bone or a chicken wing. The Chabad custom is to use a chicken neck. And it's not eaten. It's just there at this table to remind us of the Paschal offering. And the other cooked dish, we use a hard-boiled egg. That's to remind us of the festival offering. And that's universal. The egg is a universal. No matter where you go in the world, every Seder plate has an egg, and it reminds us it's a traditional dish that's served by mourners. Jewish mourners are served hard-boiled eggs to remind them of the cycle of life. And so we eat it to remind us that we're mourning, that even if we're well off doing in America, we don't have the full Jewish experience without our Bet HaMikdash. So in that sense, we're mourning the loss of our holy temple. The next item we'll move to in the center, and I'll cover the two things in the center together. This on top is maror, and at the bottom in the center is the chazeret. Now, maror means bitter herb, and chazeret is a specific kind of bitter herb. The Mishnah lists 5 items that are appropriate to use for the maror. Maror is a bitter herb, and it is what God told us to eat with on Seder night. And so there are once we eat it by itself, that's the portion that we put here. And once we eat it together with matzah later on at the Seder as a sandwich, and that goes here. But the types of bitter herbs that we put in both are identical. They have different names. And someone put in the question, why do we have different names? And because the top one is called maror and the bottom is called chazeret. And the truth is, different Seder plates don't make a distinction, and they put maror by both or chazeret by both. Maror, again, is what we're trying to experience, bitterness, to remind us, as the Torah says, of the bitterness that our ancestors experienced. So we make this a very experiential, tactile experience for us. And the chazeret is a specific type. Now, what qualifies as maror and chazeret? Maror is romaine lettuce. Chazeret is the type of maror, and chazeret means lettuce, and it's specifically romaine lettuce. But other types there are 4 other things we mentioned that are kosher for doing the maror, and that's endives, horseradish, raw horseradish, not the mixture with the beets. And then there are debates about what the other 2 remaining are. So the custom is that we do romaine lettuce and the horseradish for both. And the required amount is about a little more than an ounce of each. So not too much. But we have to be careful. Romaine lettuce has a big bug infestation these days, and therefore we should cut off the green part and just use the white part. Make sure it's super clean and make sure we eat enough. That's a simple way of doing the Maror. Now, the reason I'm going to go a little deeper here, just because someone asked specifically why we choose to call one Maror and the other one Chazeret if it's the same food items on the Seder plate. The answer is that Maror means bitterness, and Chazeret is the specific species. And so when we fulfill the mitzvah of Maror, which reflects bitterness, it's, in other words, when you have something bitter in a sandwich, it's not as bitter. It actually complements the sandwich. It gives it a little kick. When you're eating something bitter on its own, it's a quite bitter experience. So Kabbalistically, these two steps represent two of the 6 sfirot. Each item on the Seder plate corresponds to one of the 6 sfirot. And the 3 matzahs correspond to the 3 intellectual sefirot, and the Seder plate corresponds to Malchut, the lowest of the 10 sefirot. So these two correspond to mercy, rachamim, which when you go through a bitter experience, it actually brings out of you a very empathetic, merciful side to you. So that is the experience here, versus here, the experience is yesod. The sephira is yesod, which means connection. And actually, the way you make a connection is more with the chazeret step, which is the maror that's eaten together with a sandwich. So that's just to answer your question. Okay, now the other two items on the Seder plate. Hold on. One is a vegetable. We start off the Seder with a vegetable. That's in the karpas. It's called karpas, which means vegetable. Some families use parsley. The Chabad custom is to use an onion or a potato. In the Seder kits we're sending out this year, we're sending a cucumber. It could really be any vegetable. And you dip it into salt water at the start of the meal just to create questions of, hold on, this is a strange custom. Why are we doing this? And that gets the children in the mode of asking questions, as we'll get to soon. And the charoset, every time we eat the mar, we dip it into charoset. Charoset is, again, different families have different traditions. It is typically made out of apples, pears, dates, pomegranates, and walnuts. The Chabad custom is basically apple, pears, and walnuts, but many different families have different traditions. So follow your own family's traditions together with some spices like cinnamon or ginger, if that is your family's custom. And every time we eat the maror, we dip it into the charoset, but we don't actually do a heaping of charoset. We just do a little amount, and we do want to retain the bitterness of the flavor. Now, you may be thinking, romaine lettuce is not so bitter. Actually, if you leave the stalk unpicked, the longer you leave it unpicked, the more bitter it gets. It can get really bitter. And that corresponds to the Jewish people. When we came into Egypt, originally 210 years before the Exodus, we actually came in as royal guests. We were the guests of Pharaoh because we were the family of Joseph, who saved Egypt's economy. So we came in as royal guests, but then with time, they just started to harass us and embitter us until they put us into slavery. So the same thing as the Roman lettuce, it starts off sweet, but with time it gets bitter and bitter. So that's one of the explanations. And another explanation is that at its root, it's quite bitter, but as it branches out, it turns sweet, which is similar to what we find by bitter experiences. Sometimes you have to take a bitter pill, but it actually leads you to a very beautiful, sweet experience later on. So that covers the fundamentals of the Seder plate. And something to mention about the charoset. The charoset, we said, was a mixture of fruits and walnuts. It is actually meant to remind us of the mortar that the Jews had to make to lay the bricks. And that actually comes from the name chares, which is clay, which the Jews had a long experience producing. Okay, now, when do we have to do these mitzvahs of eating the matzah and drinking the wine and telling over the story of the Exodus, which are the fundamental mitzvahs, and eating the maror? Those mitzvahs all have to be done after nightfall. Nightfall is about 7:50 in Woodbury, and so that's quite late. And so my family, we take a nap on Wednesday. We're going to take a family nap so we could be well rested and energized. But before before 7:50, we talk, we sing songs, but we make sure to do all the fundamental mitzvahs, which means starting off with the kiddush, drinking the 4 cups of wine, eating the matzah, and eating the maror, and lighting the cat. We do that all after nightfall, which is about 7:50 p.m. In Torah, all days don't start at midnight. They actually start with the evening. As the Torah tells us, God created the world. Vayihi erev, vayihi voker. It was evening and it was morning, day 1. It was evening and it was morning, day 2. And that's actually that's the arc of history, that the history started off dark, and we're supposed to help history emerge bright, which that is the Jewish vision for the future. And so that is the experience. We start our days at nightfall, and just like the first Seder was done at nightfall, we do the Seder at nightfall, and we want to fulfill all the mitzvahs then. Now, there was once a wealthy man who used to invite guests to his home. And at the end of his elaborate meals, he used to allow these poor men at the table, poor guests who came to his meal, to take anything from his lavish table to take home as a souvenir. So people used to take a fork, a knife, a salad bowl. At the start of every meal, everyone was lined up, seated by their meal, and he used to ring a special bell. The servants used to come and serve everyone their dishes. And so one poor man had this idea. He says, hey, at the end of his meal, he asked for the bell. He took it home, and he gathered all the residents of his little village, and he said, come join me for a beautiful meal. It's going to be delightful. They all came to a long table. They sat around. And they're like, where's the food? He's like, just wait. You'll see. He took out the bell. He gave it a ring, but nothing happened. So he came running back to the host in the big city, the wealthy man, and he said, you tricked me. You traded me with the wrong bell. The bell that you ring brings the butlers and the bakers and the waiters. The bell that I rang brought nothing. Says he, silly man. The bell is just a signal for the butlers to come, but the butlers are already prepared and waiting. The ringing the bell is not going to do anything. So eating a matzah Wednesday morning does nothing for us. Eating it in 2 weeks does nothing for us. But eating it on Wednesday night after 7:50 and drinking the wine has enormous benefit to us. Okay, so now that's the 15th of Nisan. Okay, now we're gonna sink our meal into we're gonna sink into actually going to the deep Seder, and that reminds me of a joke. There was a man in the 1930s, a Jewish guy, saw what was coming in Poland, so he sold all his assets. He bought gold bars, melted them down, and turned them into sets of fake teeth. And when he came to Ellis Island, they asked him, why do you have these 5 sets of golden teeth? He says, I'm a religious Jew. I have 1 teeth for dairy and 1 teeth for meat. He said, that explains 2 sets. Why the other 3? He says, well, actually, on Passover, you can't use the same dishes and equipment. So I have another set of teeth for meat Passover and dairy Passover. He says, why do you have the 5th pair? Just in case I'd like to eat some ham and cheese sandwich once in a while. So when we're doing the Seder this year, it's a time to reflect on what are we aiming for this year? What obstacles do we have in our Seder? What are obstacles that are holding us back? We have made many attempts in our lives to grow, to break free, only to discover that we're in the same place. We're stuck in a circle. So on the Seder night, it's special energies. And it's a time that we can't actually break free. Like the Jewish people, they couldn't break free until God's assistance. Seder night is that night of special revelation. And so we could think about what are things that are holding us back from where we want to be? What are things that are stopping us in our tracks, preventing us from experiencing personal growth? And so it's doing a lot of internal work. And so that's something to start off with the Seder with, that reflection. Number two is important to remember that we're going to lead a Seder, and we may have plans for how the Seder will work out, but many times God sends us in a different way. So don't set don't be disappointed if God sends you in a different journey. Embrace the weirdness of the Seder that will take you in a place that may be very different than any Seder that you've ever had. So now's the time, if the women and girls haven't already lit the candles, you take the candles and you light 2 candles. If for married women, if there's no woman present, so that the men in the home light the candles with the special blessing included in the document below. And then we're ready for Kiddush. We're going to do the Seder in 8 steps. If you want to do the full Seder, look in your Haggadah. It's a 15-step. And again, there's benefits to doing the full Seder, but we're going through the basics here. So the first step, or step number 3, after you did the reflection and after you lit the candles, step number 3 is making the Kiddush. You fill up your wine, your cup with wine, fill it up overflowing. Tonight is a night of freedom. As the verse says, the cup runneth over of blessing. We want this year to be full of blessing. So fill up your cup of wine to the tippy top. You could have a small cup, but as long as it holds 3.5 ounces, the cup is fine. And you drink the wine. You make the Kiddush prayer while lifting the cup. If you don't understand the Hebrew text, read it in English. It's perfectly fine. And when you are done, drink at least half of that small cup, or if it's a big cup and you're comfortable, drink half of that, a little more than half. And we drink any food that is a mitzvah on this night to eat that represents freedom and liberation. We eat it or drink it leaning, which represents relaxation and enjoyment. And we do it leaning to the left. Left is considered a healthier way to do it, and so it's very important to do it leaning to the left. So the wine represents liberation, we do it leaning to the left. Eating matzah represents liberation, so we do it leaning to the left. The maror, eating the bitter herbs, reminds us of slavery, so that we don't do leaning. And eating the meal, the festive meal that will take place in the middle of the Seder, that's not a specific mitzvah, so also doesn't have to be done leaning. So back to Kiddush. You finish saying the Kiddush, you drink it leaning to the left, and when you are done, you could go on to the next Seder. If you're doing the full Seder, now's the time that you take the vegetable, the karpas on your Seder plate. It's either the cucumber, the onion, or the parsley, and you wash your hands without any blessings to create extra curiosity. You take the vegetable, you dip it in salt water. Salt water corresponds to our tears, and we eat it with a blessing of hadama, a blessing we say whenever we eat vegetables, and we eat it. Now this arouses some curiosity in the children, and hopefully they'll jump to ask the 4 questions, which teaches us something so important about, number 1, how to be educators. If we're trying to teach and preach to our next generation, preaching doesn't help. Don't try to force our values on our children. You have to actually generate curiosity in our children with whatever means we have. And so we can do that by getting the kids curious and being creative about it. And that actually has a much larger effect on the values that they will pick up. So this leads to that's one of the 4 questions of why are we doing this extra dipping experience? What's it all about? And then we're ready for telling over the story. And again, this is actually the longest part of the Seder, is the step of telling the story. So we ask the Manishtana the 4 questions. Before we ask the 4 questions, we fill up our glass of wine for cup number 2 of 4. We ask the 4 questions. If we're not going to have any children there, we have to be the ones asking the 4 questions. We're asking it to God, because each of these 4 questions have deeper significance. There once was an Englishman in the 1800s named Hyman, and he was to be knighted by the queen for his great generosity. And every person being knighted has to make a Latin declaration. But Jaime doesn't know Latin. So his wife says, no, do some Hebrew phrase. And the queen won't know the difference. So he says, I don't know Hebrew. He says, what do you mean you don't know Hebrew? You don't even know the Manishtana? So, oh, that's a great idea. So at the knighting ceremony, the queen is about to knight him, and he says, Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. And the queen turns to the king and says, why is this night different than all the others? So, there's a Nobel Prize winner, Isidore Rabi. He used to say, my mother made me who I am. When all the other kids would come home from school, their mothers would ask them, what did you learn today? And my mother used to ask me, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? And that's so important in our lives. Sometimes we stop exploring, we stop being curious and inquisitive about life. And the Seder night is a time to reflect on something that it's worthwhile to explore further and investigate. So now we relive the story. We break the middle matzah. We take the middle matzah because we want to have poor matzah. We make this poor man's bread even poorer, because poor people don't even have complete food. And we take the bigger half, we put it away to be our afikomen. We eat it as dessert at the end of our festive meal. But the smaller half we put back on our Seder, under our Seder plate, and we will go through the main section of the Seder with this poor man's bread. And here is where we recount the slavery of the Jewish people. We go through why do we eat the matzah and the maror, and we retell the story. So it's highly recommended that you read the text as, at least in the abridged Haggadah, the Haggadah selections that I shared in the description. This is the time when we sing Dayenu, for those that want to sing Dayenu. And this is a time when we pour the drops of the wine into the broken vessel when we mention the 10 plagues. But those are not in the selected readings, because that's not the requirement. That's not the principal requirement. If someone has to make choices of which parts to do, it is mainly telling over the story of Exodus with the passages that we read, recounting the matzah and the wine and the paschal lamb and the reasons for eating them, and eating the matzah and the maror and drinking the wine. Okay, so next, something to explore during this time and consider is, why are we celebrating an Exodus when Jews have been further persecuted afterwards? So this freedom hasn't lasted forever. So why are we exploring an Exodus from a thing that we're not really living the benefits of? So that's something to consider today, why we go through that. And it's important, deep points to consider there. And also to consider, what would be the point of a wise and knowledgeable person repeating a very familiar story? Why do we repeat the story this night if we know the story already? What's so significant? So that's something to consider as we go into this part. That gives us the right framework and mindset to actually take in the special messages of this story. Now, one of the beautiful things that the Rebbe writes is that each of us in our personal lives, the Exodus speaks loud and clear. Free yourself from the obstacles and limitations that stand in your way, preventing you from being what you should be and acting as you should. Moreover, like our constant retelling of the Exodus story, its personal message is perpetual. The personal exodus you achieved yesterday was marvelous, only by yesterday's standards, for you have subsequently grown from that experience, and it is therefore insufficient for the standards of today. So even if you're experiencing you feel like you've accomplished a lot in your life, and you feel you're perfect, don't stunt your growth. There's always more to break out of our personal Egypt or personal limitations. So, so consider why continual progress is ideal but difficult, and what is the biggest obstacle that prevents us from growth, and how can we overcome it? And consider what we would tell ourselves if we had to give ourselves a special piece of advice at this special moment to help power you forward in this regard. So that's things to consider. And then we drink the second cup the same way we did the first cup, leaning to the left. Now we're up to step 6, eating the matzah. We wash our hands for bread like we do by every festival meal and all times, and we recite 2 blessings, one blessing on the bread and one blessing on the special mitzvah of eating the matzah. We eat about a third or a half of the big round shmur matzahs. It's probably 2/3 if you're not eating shmur matzah, which you should. And the washing of the hands is actually reminds us that we have to be very careful of, we have to be very, not careful, but we have to be disciplined of what our hands are doing in life, to always make sure it's being used for good things. And that's why right after we wash our hands and clean, we go straight to doing a mitzvah by eating the matzah. So you don't have to wash your hands for 20 seconds. You do the special ritual of three times on the right hand and 3 times on the left hand. And then you're up to step 7. Step 7 is we eat the mar, the bitter herbs, not leaning. We dip it into the charoset first, but not too much charoset. We recite the special blessing for doing the mitzvah of eating mar. We consume at least 1 ounce. And if you're up to it, then you do the Hillel sandwich, is you eat 1 ounce of mar together with 1 ounce of matzah in a sandwich with the matzah on top and bottom and the mar in between. And the mar could be your romaine lettuce and your horseradish together. And that reminds us to break through, use our darkness for growth. And now we're up to the meal. At this point, some have accustomed to eat the egg that's on the Seder plate, and you can do that. There's a famous joke of the man who invites his non-Jewish friend to the Seder. He heard there's great food at the Seder. He comes, they drink wine, and they're about to eat, but then they start breaking the matzah, and they start doing the manishtana, and they start telling the story. It's going on a long time, and he's getting hungry. He says, where's all the great Passover food that I heard of? And finally, they pull out matzah, and everyone's eating matzah. And finally, they do the bitter horseradish. And at this point, he's like, what a waste of time. And he leaves. But if he would have stayed a little longer, he would have made it to the meal. So that's the classic. And then we're up to the third of the 4 cups. This is when we do grace after meals. After we eat food, for those that have the afikomen, now is the time to eat the afikomen. That's a bigger part of the matzah that we broke earlier. And we fill up the 3rd cup, just like the first 2. And we also fill up an additional cup. This is not cup number 4. This is called Elijah's cup. And there are many reasons why we do this, but Elijah the prophet is a famous prophet in Jewish teaching. And one of the things that is said about Elijah is that he will tell us when Mashiach will come. So we go to the door and we welcome Elijah the prophet after grace after meals. It's interesting to consider all the blessings that we said earlier. Thank God for the vegetable. Thank God for the bread of matzah. Those are all rabbinical obligations to recite those blessings. Whenever we're making a blessing before we eat food, it's an institution from our sages. It's not a biblical obligation. The only obligation is thanking God for the food that you already ate. Because we all turn to God when we need food. But once we have the food, we tend to forget. And that's why it's a biblical obligation to be thankful for the things that we already have. So it's something so important in this critical time to put our focus. What are the things that we have to be thankful for and appreciate them? We have running water straight to our house. We have electricity and gas straight to our house. We're able to connect over internet. We're able to get Amazon deliveries, maybe not on time, but we have so much to be grateful for. We have health, hopefully, and so many good things, and we just have to pay attention to them and be thankful for the things that we do have as well. So that's after you finish the grace after meals, you drink the third cup, and again, leaning to the left. And then the fourth cup is when we sing songs of praise to Hashem. It's called Hallow. We sing those songs of praise, and we drink the fourth cup, leaning to the left. And that's the whole Seder. So I encourage you again, those that need a Seder kit, all the items for the Seder, the matzah, the wine, the egg, we're preparing Seder kits. They will be available online till 10 p.m. tonight. 10 p.m. is the deadline, so there's an hour and a half left. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the live chat, and I would be happy to answer them. I'm putting my cell phone in the live chat in case you have any questions over the next few days. You can always call me, and I'd be happy to answer them as well. Okay. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful trip. And as we end off the Seder, we say, Leshana haba b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. So that was a quick overview of the Seder. There are many classic Seder songs. Die, die, no, die, die, no, die, die, no, die, no, die, no. And there's so much beautiful insights in the Seder and customs. And those that do a long Seder and delve into it, that's praiseworthy and worthwhile endeavor to do. We do a Seder twice, 2 nights in a row, April 8th and April 9th. Sometimes the second one people get burnt out. It's still a good myth. I think, I'm going to spend the first night maybe practicing, doing all the steps. The second night, maybe I'll dive a little deeper into the meanings of the different steps, get a good Haggadah. If you need some recommendations, give me a call or email me and be happy to address those as well. Okay, happy Passover. And again, I want to remind you to sell your chametz or buy shmura matzah, handmade matzah. Sell your chametz can be done at jewishtob.org / just visit there. There's just a link to selling your chametz. And the Seder kits is jewishtob.org / Seder to go. Those are available till tonight. You can order them till 10 p.m. and they'll be available for pickup on Monday or Tuesday. Or local delivery, we will deliver it to your door as well. Okay, happy Passover. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.